Sometime around 2010, I heard Jesus' invitation. Like I really heard it. It's that line from Matthew chapter 11. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Something about those words, they just penetrated my soul. Like, that's what I wanted. That's what I needed. And it sounds like the easiest thing in the world. Like, just rest. Just delight. Just come be with Jesus. Just enjoy him. Just enjoy being loved by him. But then I actually tried to do that. And I found that it was really, really hard. Like there was something in me that was holding me back, like something in me that wouldn't let me rest, that wouldn't let me just sit and delight with him, that wouldn't let me just worship him and enjoy being loved by him, that wouldn't let me just delight in God and creation and others. Something that made me want to go immediately back to productivity, to entertainment, to work, to scrolling on my phone, to anything. Resting felt really, really hard. And this made me curious, like what was going on in my own soul? Really the question that I was asking is, what is it that refuses? What is it within me that refuses to let me rest? And the more I've thought about this question, the more I've processed this, the more I've gone along on this journey, the more I've looked around and I've listened to your stories, and I found out that it's not just me, but it's also you, or at least most of you, struggle with this exact same thing. And today I want to start a conversation around this. Like, what is that? What is that thing that stops us from resting? Like, what is that thing that stops us from coming to Jesus? For 2 or 3 years, I've been stewing on this, and I have some ideas that aren't fully crystallized, but they're most of the way there. So anyways, today we're going to start a journey where hopefully in our conversation back and forth over the next weeks to come, we'll refine some of these ideas. But I've got enough in place in my mind, at least to start this conversation, to ask, why is it so difficult for us to rest in Jesus? And so I want to start this conversation with this gentleman. I bumped into his works a couple years ago. John Maynard Keynes, some of you may have heard of like Keynesian economics. He's that guy. So he's an economist from the early 20th century. And in 1930, he wrote an essay that I stumbled upon just a couple of years ago. Short essay entitled The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. Now I want you to get this. The year was 1930, and there's this economist, the stock market had just crashed, Great Depression is raging, he had just lost his family and fortune, and he sits down, though, to take the long view, to not look at that in particular, but to look at where economies were headed, to look at where the world was headed, look at what life would be like, and he specifically asked the question, what will life be like for my grandchildren in 100 years? What will life be like in 2030. And he predicted 2 things about life in America in 2030. The first is that people would make way more money than they needed to survive. Way more money. He predicted that they would make 4 to 8 times, not just the amount of money, but the standard of living would be 4 to 8 times greater than it was in 1930. The second thing he predicted, famously, is a 15-hour work week. He didn't actually predict a 15-hour work week. What he actually said, if you read through it, is that our biggest problem will be what to do with all of our leisure time, because industrialization would so take over that we wouldn't have to work if we didn't want to. We would have to learn, he quoted like biblical imagery here, to be like the lilies of the field that neither sow nor reap. Nobody would have to work, but people they're so used to working, they would want to work at least 3 hours a day, so he suggested a 15-hour work week. Now, his predictions about the economic growth were spot on. The only thing he was wrong about is how fast it would grow. So he predicted in 100 years we would reach that point. We surpassed that in the 1980s. In 50 years, we surpassed all of those standards of living that he predicted. But that whole thing about the 15-hour work week, not so much. Now, of course, there are many, many good reasons to work hard and work long. I don't want to say that work itself is not the problem. But Keynes made an assumption here that the point of work was to come to some state of rest, that the point of work was to enjoy what you achieve, to enjoy what you earn. But all the data across our humanity, in America at least, suggests just the opposite is true. That the richest people, the college-educated people, the people who have the option to work less, actually choose to work more. All the data suggests that more wealth, power, freedom actually leads to more work, not less work in our lives. And this isn't just true of like elites. Pre-COVID, in 2018, the stat was 27% of all Americans in the American workforce did not take all of their vacation time. Like they chose to work rather than get paid to go on vacation. Again, the question is, what is it in us that stops us from resting? Like, what is it in me? What is it in us as a people that stops us from enjoying the labor of our work? Now, Keynes imagined us living at this time like royalty, and I want to step back and try and view our lives from like someone in the 1930s. Like, he imagined us living like kings and queens, and in some ways that is absolutely true. Like, we do live like kings and queens by many standards. So our home spies, compared to back then, our homes would look palatial. They're 3 times the size of the average home size in the 1930s. Technology now serves our every whim and desire. Our lives are filled with like gadgets and services and apps that exist only to serve our every wish, to come up with our every desire. So right now, I could wish in my mind for like a pair of shoes, and I could say into the air, Alexa, buy those shoes on my wish list, and tomorrow morning, those shoes would like magically appear somewhere on my front yard. Right now, I have a machine that does my dishes and a machine that washes my clothes, and you can get a robot who does all your vacuuming. And if I want to listen to any musician in the world, I can just say that musician's name into the air. Play this musician, play Coldplay, Clocks, and I will start hearing that song play. If I wish to go somewhere, all I have to do is pull out an app and speak where I want to go into that app and press the button, and a driver will show up and take me there just moments later. If I'm in the mood for truffle fries or baba ganoush or sushi or tandoori chicken, I can get it within the hour. If I want a harem of women or men or both, my Google Assistant can give that to me instantly. And these things I'm talking about, these things that no king or queen in the ancient world ever could have experienced, this is normal. All of us have it. This is like everybody in our little sphere, at least, has that kind of freedom, wealth, power, this potential to instantly satisfy almost any imaginable desire. So here's the question, again. If life is so easy, if it's so easy to meet those needs, to get the things that we desire, what stops us from resting and actually enjoying them? Why do we look like royalty but act like slaves? So the other guy who helped me as I was processing these things is this guy. His name is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He's a famous Russian novelist. And in 1978, again, kind of before my time, the year I was born, actually, he gave his address. He gave an address to Harvard, the commencement speech. So he shows up at this place, which is like the place, like the elites of America, the people who have wealth and power and freedom, unlike any other people probably in the face of the earth. These people who embody the American dream. And then he shows up at this celebration of the American dream, and then proceeds to spend the next hour describing the moral and spiritual failure of the American dream. It's a bit awkward, but kind of interesting. And he says in this address, listen to his argument here, describing America, the American dream. Every citizen has been granted the desired freedom and material goods in such quantity and of such quality as to guarantee, in theory, the achievement of happiness. Do you hear what he's saying? He's saying, like, if freedom and money and wealth could somehow make us happy, then we should be the happiest people in the world. But we're not. Why not? He goes on to point out one psychological detail has been overlooked: the constant desire to have still more things and a still better life. And the struggle to attain them imprint many Western faces with worry, even depression. So I want to hear this long before psychologists and social scientists could chart this out for us. Solzhenitsyn, who was an outsider to the American culture, he could look in and see what was happening, maybe in a way that we couldn't see at that time, something that we couldn't see at the time, but now is painfully obvious. And he was saying this: there is a direct relationship between the American dream and happiness, but it's not the one you think. As American wealth and freedom and power increase, so does anxiety, depression, addiction, relational dysfunction, and suicidal ideation. Like, you can chart that out. Like, if you look at the social sciences and you look at economic growth, those two things grow hand in hand. As we become more wealthy, more free, more powerful, more able to fill every desire instantly, we become more anxious and more depressed and more addicted and more dysfunctional and more suicidal. Solzhenitsyn diagnoses this, his phraseology. I don't have it on the screen, but let me read this for you. Well, I do, actually, yes. He says, active and tense competition fills all human thoughts without opening a way to free spiritual development. He's saying we live in a system that turns our neighbors into competitors, that makes all of life this clinging, climbing to achieve, to make something for ourselves, to build your own identity, to be who you are, to experience everything in the world. And it keeps promising that if you do that enough, you could climb the ladder, the American dream. If you climb over everyone else, if you get enough stuff, if you have enough freedom, if you have enough power, if you can decide everything for yourself, then you'll be happy. And that promise fails. It does not develop free spiritual development there. That the way we are pursuing happiness is making us depressed. The way we're chasing wealth is leading to spiritual poverty. The way we're seeking freedom is making us into slaves. Now, whether you buy Solzhenitsyn's explanation here or not, that's not the point. There is no denying the American experience. We pursue happiness only to find ourselves less happy. We demand freedom. Like, I want to work wherever I want to work. And now we find that there's no place that we can escape work. We seek connections through social media only to find ourselves more alone. We go to Netflix looking for rest only to find ourselves more restless. We attempt to quiet our deep hunger for pleasure and intimacy. We seek that out only to find ourselves unsatisfied and addicted to porn. We keep trying to satisfy our every desire only to find ourselves enslaved by our own desires. That is so much the American experience today, that our lives are filled with this low hum of anxiety and insecurity, a creeping loneliness, a need to numb, a rumbling of low-level outrage just beneath the surface. A need to prove ourselves, a compulsion for more, a restlessness, a desire for something that is just beyond our reach, is something that forces us to feel like we had to climb, always doing, always achieving, always experiencing, always performing something in our hearts that will not let us rest. And what is that something? What is that thing that refuses to let me and you rest? Well, Solzhenitsyn and the Bible use the same word. It's slavery. They call it spiritual slavery, that there is some dark force, whatever you want to call that. There is some dark force that is coercing you, commanding you, threatening you, binding you, keeping you from experiencing the life that is truly life. But that, in my experience, is not the word that we usually use. That's not the word I've historically used. I haven't said, I feel like I'm enslaved to this thing. Like, that's just not the word we use. So here's my theory, and here's the part that I want is really a conversation. I don't know that this will resonate with you, but this has been proved out in my life over the last few years. Here's what I think I would call this. Not slavery. I think I would use the word busy. It's a much safer word. I'm not bad. My soul is not enslaved to my desires. I'm not trying to prove myself or give myself an identity through what I do or through my career. I'm not consumed with comparing myself with others or seeking the approval of others. I'm not competing with my neighbors. I'm just busy, that's all. Now let me be clear. I'm not talking about just having a full schedule. By that account, Jesus could often be called busy. I'm talking about a state of your soul. I'm talking about that inner reality that never lets you stop, never lets you rest, never lets you delight in life, never lets you just sit and be loved, be known. I'm talking about living in a chronic state of busyness. I'm talking about that almost pathological busyness that has become normal in our suburban world. And here's my thesis. Again, I'm still working this out, but here's what I think is happening in our society, in our hearts. Here's my big statement. Tell me if you think this is right. I think chronic busyness is a symptom of spiritual slavery. Now, let me unpack this a little. Symptom and sickness, they're not the same. So you might not be able to smell because your nose is plugged up, or you might not be able to smell because you have COVID. It's a symptom, right? It's symptom and sickness are not the same. So you might be busy for good reasons, and you might actually live in this deep internal spiritual freedom and be busy like Jesus was on certain days of his life. Or you might be busy because you are enslaved to something that wants to control you, devalue you, steal your joy, and ultimately steal your life. So symptom and sickness, they're not one and the same. But I would like us to consider, as a church, as a community of people trying to follow Jesus, trying to become more like him, I'd like us to at least consider the possibility that if we live in a state of chronic busyness, pathological busyness, like we find ourselves completely unable to just pause and rest ever, it might be because there's something within us enslaving us, demanding our attention, refusing to let us rest or delight or worship or just be who God created us to be. And I feel like I can be a little bit presumptuous on this because I'm speaking not just as someone who speaks against something, but someone who's experienced something deeply. I can say this because I spent most of my adult life in a chronic state of busyness. And I told myself, I was doing good. I told myself, carpe diem, I'm seizing the day. I told myself that I had to be busy because all these needs, all these real legitimate needs were all around me. I told myself, and I tried to convince myself, and I tried to convince my wife, and I tried to convince you, and I tried to convince God, I'm not bad. I'm not enslaved. I'm just busy. But then my life kind of crumbled on itself, and I crashed and burned and went to intensive counseling, and I actually paused and listened to others and listened to what my wife was saying and what my body was saying and what God was saying. And at least for me, it became clear that my chronic busyness was because I was enslaved to the gods of achievement, fear, shame, and approval. I couldn't stop doing, achieving, experiencing, helping because these gods would never, ever allow it. So today we're starting a series on the biblical command of Sabbath. Sabbath in Hebrew literally just means to cease or to stop, to rest. And it is a deep, rich, life-giving invitation to let go of our anxieties, to put aside all the work, all the doing, all the achieving, all this endless wanting, and just rest. Just be with God, just enjoy him, just delight with him, just delight in his creation, delight in others, just enjoy being who God has created us to be. It is such a simple and beautiful invitation that is echoed in Matthew 28, "Come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest." It is so simple, so beautiful, but if you actually try to do it, like if you actually try to take 24 hours off each week and just rest in God's goodness, you will likely find that it is terribly hard to do in our culture. So with our remaining time, just in preparing for where we're going to head in the weeks to come, I want to look at a biblical image that helps explain this experience. that helps put words and how the Bible would look at this. Why is it so hard to rest? The Bible actually has a story that that populates this, that wants to tell us why is it so hard to rest. This isn't just a psychological thing. This isn't just a cultural thing. That there's a spiritual reality going on here. And our text for today is the book of Exodus. We're going to start in Exodus chapter 1. Here's the situation. Here's the story of why it's so hard to find rest. God's people, the Israelites, they're enslaved in Egypt. This is just down, you guys know where Egypt is, pyramids and stuff, right? They had come to Egypt from Israel just around the corner. They had come down to Egypt to escape a famine. And it was a bit awkward because the Egyptians despised the Israelites. They called them Hebrews, which was like a racial slur. Those Hebrews were like bearded and guttural and smelled like sheep and stinky. They didn't like them. They didn't want to eat with them, didn't want to be around them. So life, it was a bit awkward, but life wasn't that bad at first. Because the Pharaoh had a covenant relationship with this guy named Joseph. You may have heard of him, had a Technicolor Dreamcoat. So it worked out pretty good for a while. The Israelites ended up taking the jobs that the Egyptians didn't want. They became sheep herders, and God blessed them. So their numbers grew and grew and grew. And we don't exactly know when, but at some point, there came on this new king, a new Pharaoh, who raised up, and he knew not Joseph. He did not have a relationship with Joseph or these Israelites anymore, and he was not a fan of all these Israelites running around. So we pick up the story in Exodus chapter 1, starting in verse 11. So this is the new policy of the new Pharaoh, they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. So, context here. At the time, Pharaoh was, by almost any account, the most wealthy, the wealthiest person in the world. But what's the wealthiest person in the world need? More stuff. So he sends them out. He forces the Israelites into slave labor because he wants more. He forces them to go build store cities so that he can save up more and more and more. Like they must serve his endless accumulation of more stuff. That is why they exist now in that world. Verse 12. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, God's blessing them. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor and brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. And in all the harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So Pharaoh, if you know anything about ancient Egyptian culture, you know that Pharaoh believed himself to be a god, or at least a son of a god, kind of like this symbolic guy who believed that he was like the god of Egypt, the god of all the earth there. He is the god of the world. And these Israelites, they are nothing to him. They are tools. They are less than animals. Their whole purpose in life is to serve his needs. So remember, Genesis chapter 1. God, when he makes the heavens and earth, he works, and then he rests. So work was good, and he made humans to serve, to be in his image. So they were to work the way he worked. But Pharaoh takes that, and he turns work into pure pain. It is dehumanizing. It is unending. It is anything that is glorified or good in work is removed. And notice, there can be no rest in Pharaoh's world. Pharaoh's world is not incidentally, it's shaped like a pyramid. He sits at the top, him and the gods, and then he has his like officials underneath him, and then the slave masters, and then at the very, very bottom are these people who are not even worthy of being called people, the Israelites. And his desire for more never stops, so they can never stop. Because if they ever stop serving his desires, well, his greatness will be threatened. So in Pharaoh's world, the Israelites are only worth what they can produce. In fact, in the next chapter, we're going to see that he so devalues them that he tells all the women to take the baby boys when they're born and throw them into the Nile. He throws them out like a piece of trash. These children made in the image of God. Fast forward to chapter 5, and one of those baby boys, though, gets rescued out of the Nile. and he grows up to become the man we know as Moses. God shows up to him at a burning bush, sends him back, says, I want you to go tell Pharaoh to set my people free. I want you to go free my people. We pick up the story in chapter 5. We see this. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go, so they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. I want to get what's happening here. The God of Israel is telling Pharaoh, who believes himself to be the God of the world, to let his people go so that they can worship him. God wants his people to stop working, to go meet him, to stop working, just to be with him, to worship him, to be in relationship with him. So what happens when God's people want to stop working so they can just go be with God? What happens is Pharaoh, the God of the world, loses his mind. Verse 2. Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord and will not let Israel go. Then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But the king of Egypt said, Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work. So what happens when God's people want to stop their work so they can be with God? Pharaoh denies that God has any authority there, and then he demands they get back to work, and then he's going to pull out all of his tricks, every trick in the book, to make sure he keeps them enslaved and under his control. Follow this, verse 6. The same day, Pharaoh gave this order. So the exact same day that this happened, he wants them to see the connection. You just asked for time off. Now this is what's going to happen. The same day Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people. You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. So what's the first thing Pharaoh does? In order to keep them enslaved, he keeps them stressed out. He knows if he can just crank up the stress enough, if he can make them physically and emotionally exhausted, then he owns them. If they are overworked, exhausted, burnt out, those people are easy to manipulate, easy to control. They will give in. So he keeps them stressed out. The next thing he does is this. He says to them, they are lazy. That is why they're crying out. Let us go and sacrifice to our God. Do you see what he's doing here? He makes them think that rest is a weakness, that it's a character flaw, that if you want to rest, you must be lazy. It's a character defect. If you devote your time just to delighting in God and enjoying his creation, you are unproductive. You are lazy. He labels the worship of God, resting, celebrating, as a character flaw or a weakness. Verse 9. Make the work harder for the people so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies. You get what he just did there? He just called the invitation to come with God, to be with God, to celebrate God. He called that lies. What does he say to them? What's the principle here? He so fills their lives with noise, make them work so much that they can no longer hear the truth. They can no longer pay attention to the truth there. Verse 10. Then the slave drivers and overseers went out and said to the people, this is what Pharaoh says, I will not give you any more straw. Go and get your own straw wherever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced at all. So the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use for straw. Do you see the strategy here? How do you keep a people enslaved? Well, you stress them out. You make them think that rest is weak. You fill their life with noise so they can no longer hear God. And then you scatter them. You keep them isolated. Like you can't let them get together. They might encourage one another. They might foment. They might rebel against you. So ideally, the best way, if you really totally want to enslave people, is keep them isolated. Ideally, keep them at home in a room by themselves and let their only interaction with other people be through a tool of the devil called Zoom. That's how you keep people enslaved. Verse 13. The slave drivers kept pressing them. I'm just joking about the Zoom thing. The slave drivers kept pressing them, saying, "Complete the work required of you each day, just as when you had straw." And Pharaoh's slave drivers beat the Israelite overseers they had appointed, demanding, why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday or today as before? So how do you keep people enslaved? I want you to hear this last point here. You give them unrealistic expectations about life, and then you heap on shame and punishment for not living up to them. Unrealistic expectations. So we could go on and on from here. Like, how do you try and keep people enslaved? But we got a pretty good list here. So let's summarize. Let's summarize where we're at just in these little bits we've covered. What's this story about? It's a literal story, right? Historical account. 3,500 years ago, God's people, they're enslaved to a king who thought he was the God of the world. And this God of the world, he turned these people, made in the image of God, into chattel. That's the word, animate tools. He devalued them. He dehumanized them. Their only identity was in what they could produce for him. In Pharaoh's world, you're only as good as what you can produce. In Pharaoh's world, you can never rest. So when Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, shows up and invites them to stop working and just be with him, when he values them as people made in his own image, when he calls them to join him, to become a kingdom of priests, to be his very children, when he does this, the God of the world loses his mind and does everything in his power to keep them enslaved. Just to review, he keeps them stressed out, makes them think rest is a weakness. He fills their lives with noise that they can no longer hear the truth. He keeps them isolated, and then he gives them unrealistic expectations about life, and then heaps on them shame for not living up to them. But then, of course, if you know the story, Pharaoh's plan backfires. God sends down 10 spectacular plagues on Egypt, defeats Pharaoh, but not just Pharaoh, the gods of Egypt, it says. And he sets his people free, that they are no longer slaves. They are beloved children. They are no longer living under Pharaoh's rule. They are no longer living under his rules. They no longer are what they produce, that they have value in and of themselves, innate value. They are loved by God. They are children of God. That God is their king, and they are called to be a kingdom of priests, to live as royalty, to enjoy that, to delight in that. And in order to fix in their mind forever who they are and what God has done in defeating Pharaoh, God gave them a commandment, a practice, an invitation. Every week, take a day off, 24 hours, to remember that Pharaoh is no longer your king, I'm your king. To remember you're no longer what you produce. You have value because I love you. To remember how I set you free from shame and anxiety and unrealistic expectations. How I invited you to connect deeply with me and with one another. How I invited you to set aside stress, to get off this crazy loop of anxiety, of producing, of always seeking more, of endlessly serving your own desires and the desires of others. Come away with me and get real rest, one full day a week. So in the teachings of Jesus and the Apostle Paul, though, we discover what you're probably already anticipating here. This story isn't just some story about some ancient Near Eastern people group, but according to Jesus, according to Paul, this is our story. Like Pharaoh may be a thing of the past, but the God of this world is still at work. And he's still enslaving people, still dehumanizing people, losing his mind when people want to follow God's invitation to stop working and just be with him. In fact, I'm betting that if you try to practice Sabbath, I mean a real Sabbath, I mean taking 24 hours off to just delight in God, to not be what you produce, to not participate in this world, to not try and keep climbing to the top of the pyramid, to not view your neighbors as competition, to not try and be captured for other people's approval or be sucked into endless, mindless entertainment. If you do that you will experience, well, I'm guessing that you'll feel stressed out. I'm guessing that if you try and take a whole day off, you might just think that, oh, what am I doing? This is so unproductive. This is so lazy. I'm guessing that if you actually try and take a full day off, that your life might be so filled with noise that you can no longer hear the truth of what God's saying to you. I'm guessing that if you try and take a full day off, that you might start to feel isolated, like I'm so alone in this, like I'm missing out on any real relationships. I'm guessing that if you try and do this, you might start to have unrealistic expectations for your life, for your kids, for your career, for your spouse, and then you'll heap shame on yourself or your kids or your spouse or your coworkers. I'm guessing that if you try and take one full day off a week and experience true Sabbath, that it'll be really, really hard. Now, it could just be that you're busy, or it could be that you're still experiencing slavery to the God of this world, and God needs to set you free. So the good news of the book of Exodus, though, is that God specializes in this. He's already done this, right? In the book of Exodus, God defeated Pharaoh. He saved his people. He set them free. He invited them to become who they're finally called to be, not just slaves, but a kingdom of priests, his very children. And then in the New Testament, we see the same picture, that is just a picture of what was to come. The Apostle Paul says that was a shadow, but the reality is Jesus Christ. That we see what God did in the Exodus just points us to ultimately what Jesus did on the cross for us. That we were slaves. We were slaves to sin. But Jesus on the cross, he defeated the God of this world, and that if we will simply accept what he did and has done for us already, that we are saved then. That it's not dependent on what we do, but on what he did. That you're no longer a slave, you're a child of God, you're royalty, you're invited to experience this rest in the same way that they were in the Old Testament. We are now fully, spiritually invited to wholeheartedly enter into God's rest. That those words, "Come to me, you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." That invitation is still for you and for me. But there's always a but, isn't there? If you want to experience that freedom, you have to, the biblical language is repent and believe. Repentance isn't just about like feeling bad about yourself. That's not what it is. It literally means to change your mind or change your direction, to change your way of thinking or living. Like you have to stop living like a slave. If you want to experience the freedom that God has called you into, you have to stop working and acting and thinking and behaving and loving like a slave. So whatever it is that won't let you really rest, whatever it is that won't let you just delight in God, whatever it is that won't let you Sabbath, you have to let go of that. And you have to believe. You have to believe what God says when he says that your value isn't based on what you produce or achieve or experience or own. You have to believe God when he says that you're a child of God. You have to believe God when he says that you can stop working and just trust him. You have to believe God when he says he'll give you a real rest. So we're going to spend the next 4 weeks looking at this concept of Sabbath, just this stopping, this ceasing. What does it mean to practice Sabbath? What are we actually stopping when we cease on Sabbath? We're like, why is the Sabbath so important? And what do we do with that? And what does that mean in our modern world, you know? But today, I want to leave you just with this question, a question and a suggestion to help us. I don't think any of us will practice the Sabbath unless we realize how much we need it. All of us are still enslaved in some way, shape, or form. All of us have something in us that stops us from seeking God, from resting in God, from enjoying God. And so my question is this: do you recognize your slavery as slavery? Do you recognize the way the God of this world is pulling against you, is trying to steal your joy, is trying to steal your life? Do you understand his threats as threats? Do you see the way he's trying to manipulate you? Do you understand your slavery as slavery? Or do you think you're just busy? This week, I would encourage you to spend time with God and ask him to show you. What is it that in you or in your life that might be stopping you from really entering into his rest? What is it in you and in your life that might stop you from practicing true Sabbath in your life? Confess those things. Ask God to save you. Like I said, Jesus already died on the cross. He already broke those things. Ask him for what it means to repent and believe so that you can experience that rest. So that's the question I want you to ponder. The second thing is a book I just want to suggest. And some of you, I know that this is a process and that if we're actually going to change and actually deal with the junk in our heart, it's more than just listening to a sermon once a week or thinking about a question. So this is a guide that I think might be helpful. It's called Keeping the Sabbath Holy by Marva Dawn. If you pull out your phone and say, Alexa, buy me Keeping the Sabbath Holy by Marva Dawn, it'll show up magically on your front yard tomorrow. And the reason why I want you to buy this book is because it's 28 chapters, and it's designed to be read one chapter a day for 4 weeks. And it just happens that if you get it this week and you start reading on Sunday, that would perfectly align with the 4 more weeks that we're going to go through this series. And I just thought Marva Dawn might be a good guide. You don't have to do that, just a suggestion, but for those of you who want some guide to how do I work through these things, how do I find what's stopping me from resting in God, and how do I enter into his rest, this is a great guide to that. Can't wait to see you next week. Can't wait to hear what God says to you, and I'd love to hear your feedback and thoughts on this. Miss you, church.